Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World. I'm your host. If you're new here, this is where we strip away the jargon, ignore the mainstream media fluff, and use cold, hard economic logic to find the truth hidden in the numbers. We analyze the absurd, we laugh at the incompetence, and we restore the full picture of the global economy. Today is November 28, 2025. Grab your coffee or perhaps something stronger, considering the state of the Eurozone, because today we are diving into a phenomenon that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. We are witnessing the Great Trespass. For decades, the cardinal rule of central banking was simple: you have one job. 1. Keep prices stable. You sit in your ivory tower, you look at inflation charts, you adjust interest rates, and you keep your mouth shut about everything else. You do not talk about politics. You do not talk about war. You certainly do not talk about how the government should spend its money. But folks, that world is dead. As we sit here in late 2025, the guardians of the euro, Madame Christine Lagarde at the ECB and Joachim Nagel at the Bundesbank, are climbing down from the tower. They are putting on combat helmets. They are lecturing governments on defense spending, EU voting reform, and climate strategy. Why are they doing this? Is it an ego trip? Is it a necessity? Or is it the beginning of the end for the one thing that keeps our money worth something: central bank independence? Let's peel back the onion. First, let's look at the context. It is November 2025. The global economy is a mess of contradictions. In the United States, the Trump 2.0 administration is in full swing, aggressively pressuring the Federal Reserve to slash rates despite sticky inflation, using tariffs as a blunt force instrument. In the East, the Chinese economy is pivoting hard toward technological autarky. And in Europe? Europe is, as usual, having an existential crisis. Inflation in the Eurozone has finally settled back near the 2% target after the trauma of 2022 to 2024. Mission accomplished, right? Time to pack up and go home? Apparently not. ECB President Christine Lagarde and Bundesbank President Joachim Nagel are no longer content with just managing the currency. They are now opining on the grand strategy of Europe. Just this week, we heard Nagel, the head of the supposedly ultra-conservative, stay-in-your-lane German Bundesbank, floating the idea of joint EU borrowing to fund the military. Let that sink in. A German central banker suggesting we print shared European money to buy tanks. If you told a German economist this in 2015, they would have fainted. Nagel calls this modern central banking. I call it mission creep on steroids. And he's not alone. François Villeroy de Galha, the head of the Bank of France, is on stage saying, "We give general light, we don't give lessons." Which is a very polite, French way of saying, the politicians are incompetent, so we have to tell them what to do. They are talking about abolishing the veto power of EU member states. They are talking about combating the far right. They are talking about the structural inability of Europe to compete with the US and China. Now, on the surface, this sounds noble. Someone has to lead, right? But as an economist, when I see a central banker talking about defense budgets, my alarm bells don't just ring, they explode. To understand why this is happening, we have to look at the political landscape of Europe in late 2025. Why are the technocrats stepping up? Because the politicians have stepped out. Across the major European capitals, we are seeing a paralysis of leadership. The political class is bogged down in coalition infighting, terrified of populists, and paralyzed by budget deficits. The war on the EU's eastern flank is still grinding on, a brutal attrition that requires massive capital. Meanwhile, the US has erected a protectionist wall, and China is dumping EV tech at rock-bottom prices. The political leaders, let's be honest, don't have a plan. They are reactive. Enter the central bankers. These are people with long mandates who don't have to run for re-election next week. They look at the data. They see that without a massive upgrade in European defense and energy independence, the economy they are supposed to regulate will simply cease to function. Catherine Nice, the chief European economist at PGIM, put it perfectly: it's very difficult for central bankers to stay silent in such decisive times. She's right. If you are the captain of the Titanic and you see the iceberg, but the guy driving the ship is drunk, do you grab the wheel? Lagarde and Nagel have decided to grab the wheel. They are arguing that you cannot separate price stability from national security. If Putin turns off the gas, inflation spikes. If supply chains collapse because of a trade war, inflation spikes. Therefore, they argue, defense policy is monetary policy. It's a clever argument. It's also a trap. Now, let's add the spice. Politics is never just about policy, it's about personnel. It's about ambition. We are approaching a critical changing of the guard. By the end of 2027, 4 of the 6 members of the ECB's executive board, including Queen Christine herself, will be replaced. The race for the top job, president of the European Central Bank, is already quietly underway. Joachim Nagel wants that job. But there is a problem. To get that job, he needs to show he isn't just a rigid German Neinsager. He needs to show the French and the Italians that he can play ball. That he understands solidarity. So, Nagel's sudden openness to joint debt and his criticism of the far right isn't just about saving Europe. It's a job interview. He is signaling to the rest of Europe, look, I'm not like the old Bundesbankers. I'm modern. I'm flexible. Make me king. However, this 4D chess move has a massive obstacle, Friedrich Merz. In our current timeline, Merz is the German chancellor. Merz is from the CDU. He is a fiscal hawk. He looks at Nagel's comments about joint borrowing with the enthusiasm of a vampire looking at garlic. If Nagel alienates his own government in Berlin by being too European, he loses his backing. But if he sticks to the German line, the French will never let him run the ECB. And don't forget Olli Rehn from Finland, who is also gunning for a leadership spot, echoing these same sentiments to sound relevant. It is a high-stakes game of musical chairs played with trillion-euro bond markets. Now, let's get to the core economic danger. This is the part where we stop laughing and start worrying. There is a reason central bank independence became the gold standard in the late 20th century. We learned painfully, through the inflation of the 1970s, that if you let politicians control the money printer, they will print money to win elections. Every single time. The deal was, politicians run the country, central bankers run the money. The bankers are unelected, unaccountable, and boring. That is their strength. But here is the fundamental truth of power dynamics: if you enter the political arena, you cannot complain when the politicians enter yours. Emanuel Monch, a professor in Frankfurt with experience at the Fed and Bundesbank, hit the nail on the head. If central bankers become increasingly involved in political discussions, they also may have to accept that politicians interfere in monetary policy. We are already seeing this. Look at the United States. Donald Trump is currently harassing the Fed to cut borrowing costs. He is shattering norms. Now look at Europe. Politicians in France and Italy, seeing the inflation rate drop, are screaming at the ECB. They don't just want lower rates, they want a return to quantitative easing. They want the ECB to start buying their debt again so they can fund their populist promises without raising taxes. This is the quid pro quo. If Nagel and Lagarde say, you governments need to spend more on defense and change your voting rules, the governments will reply, okay, fine. But you need to lower interest rates to 1% and buy our bonds so we can afford it. Do you see the danger? Once the central bank admits that its mandate includes supporting general economic policies, the government can argue that any spending is essential for those goals. We need to print 100 billion euros for, national security. We need 0% interest rates to fight, climate change. The moment the ECB becomes a political actor, it loses the ability to say no. And the moment a central bank cannot say no, the currency is doomed. We are risking the lirification of the euro. Why is this happening specifically in Europe? Why isn't the Bank of England governor giving speeches about UK military strategy? Because the Eurozone is a Frankenstein monster. It has a monetary head but no fiscal body. In the US, if Texas goes bust, Washington sends money. In Europe, if Italy goes bust, the Germans complain, and the ECB has to step in and rig the bond market to keep the country afloat. Catherine Nice points out, the ECB is confronted with an incomplete monetary union without a fiscal union, fault lines in the euro's architecture. The ECB has spent the last 15 years using duct tape to hold the Eurozone together. They did it during the sovereign debt crisis by forcing austerity. They did it during COVID by printing trillions. Now, in 2025, faced with Russian aggression and economic stagnation, they realize the duct tape isn't enough. They need a fiscal union. They need a Europe that acts like a country. But the politicians won't build it. So, the central bankers are trying to force it into existence by talking about joint debt and capital markets union. They are trying to fix a political problem with monetary tools and rhetorical pressure. It is a desperate act. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers don't lie. The EU economy is currently growing at a pathetic 0.4% annualized rate. Productivity growth is flat. Meanwhile, the US economy, fueled by AI investment and energy dominance, is pulling ahead. Europe needs to invest an estimated 800 billion euros per year just to keep up with the US and China in defense and tech. Where is that money coming from? Germany is constrained by its debt brake. France has a budget deficit spiraling near 5.5% of GDP and is under an excessive deficit procedure. They can't borrow more. This is why Lagarde and Nagel are speaking up. They know that if Europe doesn't invest, the economy collapses in the long run. But if they invest by just printing money, the currency collapses. Nagel's proposal for joint borrowing is essentially an attempt to use Germany's credit card to pay for the whole bloc's defense, circumventing national debt rules. It is clever financial engineering. But legal experts are warning that the ECB is walking on thin ice. The Bundesbank Act tells Nagel to advise the government. But the ECB's mandate is independence. Dutch central bank head Olaf Slijsbeen just gave a speech in Dublin urging an overhaul of the EU's €2 trillion budget. Since when does a Dutch banker redesign the EU budget? Since the politicians failed to do it. So, what is the truth behind the event? The truth is that Europe is in a geopolitical emergency, and its political system is too fragmented to respond. The central bankers, the technocrats, are stepping into the void. They are trying to save the European project. But in doing so, they are making a Faustian bargain. They are trading their most precious asset, independence and neutrality, for short-term political influence. If they succeed, they might push Europe toward a federal state with a real army and a unified budget. If they fail, and this is the likely scenario, they will simply politicize the euro. They will invite politicians like Merz, Le Pen, or whoever comes next, to treat the ECB not as a guardian of value, but as a piggy bank for their agendas. When you see Joachim Nagel talking about tanks, don't think, oh good, someone is handling defense. Think, the firewall between money and politics is burning down. In the short term, this might look like leadership. In the long term, it looks like inflation. Because when the lines blur, the printing press always spins faster. Keep your eyes on the bond yields, folks. The technocrats have left the building, and they are out on the streets. It's going to be a bumpy ride. I'm Boss Economic World. If you want to understand how to protect your assets while the central bankers play general, hit that subscribe button. See you next time.